Donkey Kong was one of Nintendo's most notable arcade experiences, and its sequel, Donkey Kong Jr., was also very popular. Unsurprisingly, these games got ports to several major consoles, as well as Nintendo's own NES. However, these ports are not the focus of today's discussion. My question is, how would you take Donkey Kong, or Donkey Kong Jr. specifically, an arcade action platforming game, and make it work on a Game & Watch? Some of you might know that there exists more than one version of Game & Watch Donkey Kong Jr. In fact, there are actually many versions of this game. These versions include the new widescreen release, ports to both the GBC and GBA, and a re-release of the game on DSi. On top of that, there was a different game under the same name of DK Jr., but instead released under two different Game & Watch series, Panorama and Tabletop, as well as another different game, this time called DK2, that is very similar to the other DK Jr. Game & Watch games, just with a different level, and that was released under the multi-screen series. While I had considered just focusing on the new widescreen version, I decided I would try and review all of them. The graphics of DK Jr. look extremely nice for an LCD game, and are surprisingly detailed all things considered. The character sprites of the three characters are very well drawn, and Donkey Kong Jr.'s exaggerated poses help to emphasize his movements. While all of the moving objects are in black and white, the backdrops are colored and have an almost painted look to them. Overall, Donkey Kong Jr. Game & Watch has great aesthetics. The ports to GBC and GBA, however, don't have the same painted look, and instead have pixel graphics. The obvious reason is the lower screen resolution of Game Boy screens compared to Game & Watch displays. I personally prefer the pixelated graphics in the Game Boy Color version compared to the original or GBA versions, but that might just be me. Either way, the DSi has a higher resolution screen, so the graphics are smoother, although still a little pixelated. Donkey Kong 2 also looks good and is pretty much the same as DK Jr. Not much else to say, except that the game did get a port in Game & Watch Gallery 3. Wait just a second. This looks so bad. I understand that DK2 was a multi-screen game, and I know that the other multi-screen games on the Gallery collections don't look much better, but if this was the best they were able to do, was it really worth it? You know what, let's just move on. Compared to the other versions, the Panorama and Tabletop versions look quite different. The graphics are in full color, even the moving sprites, and they look amazing. Just like the other versions, DK Jr. sprites are very expressive and look great. They even have a sprite for balloons popping. This version takes the painted aesthetic even farther, with a look that could almost be described as watercolor. It looks beautiful, especially for an 80s handheld game. DK Jr. Panorama debatably looks even better than the arcade original, and leagues above the other versions. Even though all of these games look really nice, the gameplay is still the main focus. For a Game & Watch game, it plays fairly closely to the arcade version. Much like in that version, DK Jr. runs and jumps his way to Donkey Kong to save him from Mario. The enemies from the arcade version return, and they must either be dodged or attacked with falling fruit. DK Jr. can grab onto vines to climb away from threats, as well as to proceed in the level. Unlike in the arcade version, however, once you reach the end of a stage, you need to jump and grab the key, which is swinging back and forth on a rope. The catch is that the rope can only be grabbed at the peak of its swing, and failing to correctly time your jump sends DK Jr. smashing into the ground. While catching the rope might sound easy, the respawning enemies keep you on your toes and force you to time your jump well, or risk losing a life. You have to beat the level 4 times without getting a game over to save DK. Replaying the level was probably added to replicate the multiple levels of the original, which is acceptable given the limits of the portable technology. All of these elements form a game that can be seen as harder than the arcade release, but one that is also more enjoyable on the higher stages. The engaging levels wouldn't be much without good controls, and luckily, DK Jr. delivers. Jr. can move very fast across the level, and jumping and dodging enemies is satisfying. In some cases, the controls feel a little better than the arcade game. I really like the original Donkey Kong Jr., but the controls are definitely not perfect. The movement is very stiff, the jump feels too heavy, and the climbing is really slow. Since inputs in DK Jr. Game & Watch move you to the next tile instantly, it feels far more responsive. Even when many enemies are crowding you, it never feels unreasonable to dodge them all. And it feels great to do so. Now that I've talked about the new widescreen release of Donkey Kong Jr., let's move on to Donkey Kong 2. This game is essentially the same as DK Jr., except now it is split across 2 screens. You still control DK Jr., now running through 2 different downgraded levels from the arcade game, and you try to save Donkey Kong. To save DK, however, you take a key up to one of the locks holding him captive. When you grab a key, Jr. will throw it higher up the level, requiring you to grab it multiple times. Once you unlock a lock on the top screen, a new key will spawn on the bottom screen. Now all of this might sound fine, but even though Donkey Kong 2 is longer, harder, and more complicated than DK Jr., I personally don't like it for a number of reasons. To start with some nitpicks, the controls are not very responsive. While this game used a directional pad for movement instead of just 4 buttons, it isn't enough to save these controls. There is now a delay between each movement, whereas the original let you mash left or right and fly across the level. Maybe you weren't supposed to be able to move this fast, but it was fun nonetheless, and it makes DK2 much less fun. My next issue is the two-screen setup. While it was a creative way to fit 2 levels in this game, or rather one big level, I just don't enjoy either of these screens as much as the one screen of Junior, and it overcomplicates a game that shouldn't be so complicated. The 2 screens also compound my next issue. The game is just too long. I know that might sound really weird, but I feel that this game drags on forever when you need to go back and forth over and over again just to get the key and take it up and repeat and repeat and repeat. It tends to feel like a monotonous slog to play, and my least favorite version of the ones I'll cover today. Overall, Donkey Kong 2 isn't a terrible game, but it is one I get very little enjoyment out of. The final Game & Watch version of Donkey Kong Jr. is the Panorama and Tabletop release. Gameplay-wise, it takes elements from both of the other games and puts a unique spin on them, while also having some ideas of its own. Much like Donkey Kong 2, you grab a key and use it to unlock all of the chains that hold DK. Unlike DK2 though, you just grab the key rather than having to collect it multiple times on the way to the lock, which is a great change. The game's controls are also back to being super responsive, and the game returns to one screen. New to Panorama is the ending segment. Rather than just climbing and jumping your way to the end, you now have to use umbrellas and balloons to cross and use good timing to unlock each chain. If you fail to time this part correctly, Junior drops the key in the lake, forcing you to go back and get a new one. While I'm not a fan of having to backtrack through the level just like I had to in Donkey Kong 2, the condensed level size does help quite a bit. Just in general actually, Panorama feels like an improvement of Donkey Kong 2, and while I'm not a huge fan of the key collection, I would rank this game right alongside the new widescreen release for sure. The only major problem I can think of with this game is that the enemies are just way too easy. But other than that, Donkey Kong Jr. Panorama is a really fun Game & Watch title, even if the new widescreen version is more fun for me. Even though we have now talked about all of the original Game & Watch releases, we still have to talk about the remakes on Game & Watch Gallery 3 and 4. For those who don't know, the Game & Watch Gallery series were collections of Game & Watch games that were released on the Game Boy line of Nintendo handhelds. Along with faithful ports of the original Game & Watch games, these collections also included remakes of the games with new features and enhancements, and Donkey Kong Jr. is no exception. It's a little bit weird that Junior got ports to both Game & Watch Gallery 3 and 4, but it doesn't matter too much. Anyways, the remakes featured across the GBC and GBA are essentially the same, but the GBA version does have better graphics. Speaking of the graphics, both of these remakes look absolutely incredible. Even compared to the original arcade cabinet, these remakes look so much better that it's not even funny. Everything is so detailed, the sprites are beautifully drawn, the color palettes are exquisite, they don't even look like the games they are remaking, and it is admirable that the developers were willing to put in so much effort. The game also looks far smoother, largely because it is actually animated now. Of course, the GBA version looks much better than on GBC, but the latter still looks amazing for the hardware. The quality continues with much improved gameplay. The controls are almost as fast and responsive as the new widescreen release, even considering the new movement. Jumping feels much better than on any of the Game & Watch releases, and the same goes for climbing. I haven't said much on the enemies up till now, because there wasn't much interesting to say. The enemy design in these remakes, on the other hand, is really quite good. There are 4 different enemy types: the Goomba, the Spinies, the Nipper Plants, and the Bullet Bills. You can jump on the Bullet Bills and Goombas, but not the other enemies. The enemies, combined with the level designs, allow this game to stay interesting for far longer than any of the other Game & Watch versions. Speaking of the levels, that's another thing that this game has over the Game & Watch versions. There are now 3 levels to play, and these levels are all well designed. The levels have good visual variety, with each level taking place in a different biome. While the game does have the key collection system, the keys are mainly there to make you take a different route through the level, rather than just forcing you to go back and forth in the stage several times to win. Every time you get to DK and use a key, Junior automatically goes back to the beginning of the level, much like in the new widescreen release, which makes the key collection system much more bearable. Also much like new widescreen, each level has an obstacle blocking DK that can only be overcome with good timing, from a spinning platform to some flickering clouds and even birds flying to and from the screen. Not only do these obstacles require good timing to cross, but they also increase the visual variety even further. I've recently been playing a lot of the Game & Watch Gallery games, and from that experience, I've realized that I really don't like the modern versions of most of these games. They generally overcomplicate the original games, in the best cases. In the worst of cases, you end up with Modern Chef, which is just, it's not good. Because of that, I really wasn't super confident going into Modern DK Jr. on Gallery 3 and 4, but I was extremely impressed with what I found. Oh, and speaking of Gallery 3, some of you might be wondering how good the modern version of Donkey Kong 2 is. DK2 is easily the worst version out of all of these in terms of controls, level design, and even graphics, so a modern version could really improve on the game's setup while making it more fun. So, how is that modern version? I am glad you asked. The modern version doesn't exist. Yep, no modern version in sight. May I ask why? The port of DK2 and Gallery 3 is so bad that a modern version is sorely missed. I get that the other unlockable games in Gallery 3 don't have modern renditions either, but that doesn't really make its absence any better. Ball in Gallery 2 had a modern version, despite that game's similar unlockable status. Now to be fair, Ball's modern version was pretty bad, but it was at least there. So now that I've discussed every Game & Watch version of Donkey Kong Jr., as well as all their ports, I might as well rank them. Last place is easily Donkey Kong 2 on Gallery 3. It looks terrible, doesn't play too well, and is a port of a game that wasn't even very good to begin with. Speaking of which, Donkey Kong 2 is up next. While it is a lot better than its port in Gallery 3, it's still not a very good game in my opinion. Next in line is New Widescreen's port in Game & Watch Gallery 4. While I really like the underlying game here, I personally think that this is the worst looking version you can play, which is why it's so low on the list. I'm gonna put the Panorama and Tabletop versions afterwards. These games aren't bad at all. In fact, they're actually quite good, but the key collection and backtracking makes me rank them below the games coming up. On to the original, New Widescreen release. This is my favorite of the original 3 Game & Watch releases, and I think it is still phenomenal for an LCD game in 1982. Even still, I personally prefer 2 of its ports. One of those ports is the following entry, the port on DSi. Not only do I think it looks better, but it's also easier to play in 2022. My favorite port, however, is Gallery 3's port on GBC. It looks even better and plays just as well as the original. The remakes are up next, and while both of these remakes are really good, I'm gonna put Game & Watch Gallery 4's modern version next. While this game does look amazing and play pretty well, I still think Game & Watch Gallery 3's modern version is slightly better, and is the best version of Game & Watch Donkey Kong Jr. The graphics, while not as advanced as the ones on GBA, still look very appealing, and I personally find this version plays better. Not by much, mind you, but the enemy hitboxes are slightly more forgiving, and timing tends to be a little less strict. I suppose it's time for the conclusion now, huh? Donkey Kong Jr. for Game & Watch, no matter what version you play, is a game that is seriously impressive. Nintendo took an idea that had every right to fail, an arcade action platformer for a device that couldn't even display motion, and created a game that not only works, but manages to be, in my opinion at least, a little better than the arcade version. Donkey Kong 2, even though it's not great, still clearly had a lot of effort put in, effort that shouldn't go unappreciated. I'm not saying any of these games are my favorite game of all time or anything, but I still really enjoy all of them for all they managed to accomplish. And those many accomplishments are what makes these, to me at least, the very best Game & Watch games ever released. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time I decide to upload, I guess.